Hello, this is Dr. Mike, and I wanted to share with you just a little bit of my perspective on the history that we are studying this week. We have last week looked at the early Greeks and talked a little bit about the things that we get from them in Western history in the way of philosophy and thought processes and human government. Those early days, we get the idea of a democracy. And of course, as I said previously, this is probably the only true democracy that we ever have in history, other than maybe the Iroquoian Confederacy much later in the 1700s, which operate very much off of the same kind of Greek principles. Most Americans are kind of confused when it comes to the kind of government that we have in America. And we talk in terms of democracy and republic, and most people don't realize the difference. But one of the hindrances of a complete democracy where one man gets one vote is the tedious nature of trying to vote on everything and ruling by a majority, which it can be rather tedious and can be rather unstable. Democracy, the rule by the people, is really the most unstable type of government because people are fickle, as you know, from watching politics today, and tend to feel very strongly about their politics, and it can shift in one way or the other. A republic, on the other hand, a democratic republic, which is what we have in the United States, we rest our voting and our representation in the leaders that we elect directly and we send to Washington. And in theory, they're supposed to vote for our best interests. They cannot vote on our behalf because they can't split themselves into multiple votes and vote for everybody within their constituency, but they certainly can listen to the opinions of people and then vote from that. And so that is the reason why they didn't choose in the Constitutional Convention of 1787. They did not choose a democracy. In fact, Mr. Franklin, when he stepped out on the street one day, some passerby asked him, said, "Mr. Franklin, what kind of government have you given us?" He said, "A republic, sir, if you can keep it." And so that's what we've been trying to do ever since 1787, is to keep the republic and to make it something important. You're going to see that in the first half of the Roman Empire, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. But Rome will first begin as a republic and then will devolve into a dictatorship under the Caesars, and will have a pretty noted effect on government from there. But before we do that, I want to talk about the Greeks at the end of their dominance on the historical scene. You very well know Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was a Macedonian. His father was the king of Macedon. Before him, Philip II, and Philip was killed. And Alexander the Great took the reins of power at a very early age, about 21. And within 13, 14 years, he had conquered most of the known world of that day. He had taken Egypt, which we have said very difficult to do because Egypt is on a delta in the north and surrounded by deserts, and yet he is one of the few in history to actually capture Egypt. There were two different groups within the intermediate kingdoms between the Old Kingdom, the Middle, and the New in ancient Egyptian history that were managed to take the kingdom for a short period of time. But Alexander the Great, and then of course Napoleon in 1800s will take Egypt. So there's a very short history of that being a possibility. But anyways, Alexander the Great takes this great entourage of his army. And it's not just an army per se, but he also takes with him scientists, people to study the flora and the fauna of the areas where they're going and documenting. So it's almost like an educational expedition in addition to an army that is moving. And he takes with him his own tutors and teachers, and he's learning, but he never goes back to Greece once they leave on this grand military escapade. And so they literally take the Babylonian kingdom, the Medes, the Persians, and there's some really great stories of Alexander. Of course, you know them from biblical accounts. Great rulers. The Babylonians, of course, took Israel into captivity, and the Medes and the Persians, Cyrus the Great and Darius the Mede, were great rulers, but Alexander was able to conquer and to destroy their kingdoms. And Babylon kind of became his unofficial home, or until he died. But they went as far to the east as India. And there's some great accounts of them trying to learn to fight battles with elephants coming against them. And that was quite an interesting thing. And finally, they continue to want to go east. And Alexander's army apparently rebelled against him and said, no, we haven't been home in 11, 15 years, whatever. And we want to see our families. And so they wouldn't go any further. The story is told that Alexander at 32 sat down and wept because there weren't any more worlds for him to conquer. And so they come back to Babylon and intermarry with Babylonians and different things that happen, but he does not ever go back to Greece. Alexander dies, probably at the hands of an assassin, someone that poisoned him, but he died quite early. And his kingdom was divided into 4 great kingdoms, led mainly by his generals: Egypt under the Ptolemies, the Seleucids over the Middle East, and others. And so they take the kingdom, and it's there when the Romans rise to power and finally take over much of the Mediterranean world. The next great kingdom or great empire to follow them would be the Romans. And the Romans start by taking the Italy from the Etruscans. They're all great old stories, and Romulus and Remus finding Rome, and their brothers, and they're orphans, and they are suckled by a wolf, and the wolf raises them as their own children. That's where we get that phrase, by the way, when you see children that are out of control, we say they must have been raised by wolves. That is a reference back to Romulus and Remus, who historically were raised by these wolves and came into the historical document at that point in time. But at any rate, the Romans began with a republic that is going to last about 500 years. They're going to adopt many of the Greek practices. One thing I failed to say in Alexander's move to the east and across the land is that they spread Greek philosophy and Greek administration and Greek language and all these things that were Greek. Every place that they captured, they kind of influenced it greatly with their architecture and with all these other things that they have as a part of a great culture. So that you do find in India some marks of Greek architecture, Greek culture, Greek philosophy, Greek thinking, the influence upon Indian people, upon the people in Egypt, all of these different things. And so this is kind of in place, and the Romans will capitalize on that. They literally take the Greeks, when they take the empire, they bring back Greek slaves to Rome to be teachers and to be the pedagogues who will teach their young people languages and philosophy and history. And so that great Greek influence is going to have a marked effect upon the Romans. I think I said last time that the Greeks were not great technology people. They did not build many great. They did some, of course. You think of the Acropolis in Athens. They weren't great builders. What they did was phenomenal, but they were mainly science people. They were thinkers. They were philosophers. The Romans, on the other hand, were not great philosophers. They borrowed what they knew from the Greeks, but they were great builders. One of the things you'll learn about Western history, and you think about this, we're not very savvy when it comes to inventing things. But the West has always been a master of thieves when it came to stealing things and adapting them to meet new needs. For instance, when we get to the 1500s, we talk about the printing press and Gutenberg, and we often erroneously say that Gutenberg invented the printing press. He did not. We borrowed that or stole it, quote unquote, from the Chinese, who also invented paper. But we adapted it by adopting movable type, which is what Gutenberg contributed to that technology and made it very useful. That is always the pattern in the West. You adopt something from other cultures, you adapt it to fit new things, and maybe do things with it that no one ever envisioned doing. We borrowed fireworks from the Chinese, but we developed guns from that. And so that became something that we would use in conquering other peoples. So the Romans take all of these things and these teachers and this Greek influence, and they build quite a civilization during the Republic. And the Republic is set up where you have a Senate and you have pages and the tribunes who represent the poor people. And so it's really quite a phenomenal government setup, one that we pattern our own government after. They developed the 12 tables, which were like the 10 Commandments or the Code of Hammurabi, were a set of given laws that people were protected under and were convicted by. And so this becomes this great civilization, great armies, and they begin to conquer most of the known world as a republic. And then we get to the time of Julius Caesar, who has this great army in Gaul, and he is an ambitious man, as Mark Anthony will say at his funeral. But he brings that army back and forces himself into the position of being one of the two consuls or the two presidents that rule the country. And of course, very quickly, it becomes a dictator. And he was killed by the Senate, stabbed to death by the Senate. Of course, the dictatorship will continue under his nephew Octavius or Augustus Caesar, and we get into New Testament biblical times. And of course, Rome will last up until 476 BC, when it will, or I'm sorry, CE or the Common Era or AD, whichever notation system you're using, when it falls to attacks from the north, from the Germanic tribes and the Visigoths and the Vandals and the Huns and various barbaric groups. I like movies, and I often watch the Gladiator movie for a couple of things. Number one, I may have mentioned this to you already, I like to see the technology of the Roman army. I encourage you to go back and look at that, because it's a great look at the technology that they had. The other was that the Caesar at that time was Marcus Aurelius, which was probably the last of the good Caesars. And he's trying to get the country from the dictatorship back to the republic. And so he offers the rule to the general, who ends up being the gladiator, who of course dies. But that doesn't happen because the mechanics of politics has grown so greatly and moved so quickly forward that there is just no going back. And so Rome will end up, dying and this, but the influence of the Roman Empire on our society is great. So this week you're talking about the Republic. So keep in mind that is the model of a lot of our government in the United States. And then we move into the empire. That's something that in my students' reading, I find they don't draw that line very carefully to realize that there were two parts of the Roman Empire, both of them approximately 500 years each. And of course, then the Christianity actually becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire in 391 under Theodosius. And then, of course, Rome falls in 476. And part of the blame was placed upon the fall of Rome on it changing its religion. It said for, these almost 1,000 years, we have survived under our gods, and they've kept us safe. We adopt this new religion, and within 70 years, we have fallen. I personally think, if you look at it rather closely, that instead of Rome really falling, it kind of morphed into the Roman Catholic Church, and the Roman Catholic Church is going to become a political religious entity. It is of some consequence that the Pope carries one of the titles of the old Roman emperor. And of course, Rome divides its administration at some point there and puts a Caesar, if you will, in Constantinople to rule the Eastern Empire. And of course, the Western Empire will be in the West and with the Caesars. Once it goes away, you will have religion after 1054 and the Great Schism. You'll have two religious powers that are political powers. You'll have the Roman Catholic Church with the Pope in Rome, and you will have the Eastern Orthodox Church with their Pope in Constantinople. And the ones in Constantinople will actually operate as a Roman Caesar much more even than the Pope in Rome. So these are interesting things to think about, maybe things we can't necessarily nail down to say, well, that's exactly what happened, but you do see the evidence of it. The Roman Catholic Church will shift after the fall of Rome to North Africa, which is another really great study for future thought, and will continue on till today. But you realize that the Roman Church today is a political power. They have their own curia, they have their own diplomats, they have their own land that is separate from Italy. They have very powerful income, And so we think about the differences between, Rome today and Rome as it was then, and realize that the church has had a tremendous influence. I hope some of this resonates with you, at least gets you to think about the things that you want to think about in this section. And if you have any questions, please send those to me. I'll be happy to try to respond to them to you. Thank you.